We are going to start the third and final panel of this afternoon. It will be similar to the previous panel. We'll have two small presentations, responses to the book, and then Professor Shusterman will have the chance to reply. So the first response is by Antonio Cardiello, who's a specialist in Fernando Pessoa and also works on Nietzsche and Eastern philosophy. And the second presentation is by Bartholomew Ryan. You already seen him this afternoon. He works on Kierkegaard, Pessoa, Joyce, many literary and philosophical authors. They are both here from the new University of Lisbon. So without further ado, I'll give the word to Antonio Cardiello. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Elder, for the presentation. I need to be very quick, so I'll try to stay in the time also. I'm going to share. I don't know if I'm sharing already. No?
Not yet sharing.
Not sharing right now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So.
Got to bring a full screen.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah.
So this is the title of my presentation. I was in doubt because I chose this inconvenience, but maybe the best word is trouble. We will see why. So I have really this first presentation. I will try to split the presentation in two parts. The first one shorter. There are some questions for Professor Shusterman, because they are related to his book. The second part is also related to Professor Shusterman's book, but it's more it's my try to maybe try to include in the short list of the second chapter. I have here some passages of the philosophy and art of writing. In the second chapter, there are these key philosophers, key thinkers, and the names are Augustine, Montaigne, Wordsworth, and Kierkegaard. So the second part of my presentation, it's a try to probably, I don't know if Professor will agree, to include in this short list also Émile Cioran. And so the Cioran is the theme, was the topic, the major topic of this presentation. So I choose these passages and some key words, a key concept to try to explain my position. So what we have here, we have this passage where these four thinkers, these four key thinkers, make the art of writing essential to the art of living and quest for self-knowledge, self-improvement, and wisdom. So these are also my four key concept for the rest of the presentation. And I consider very interesting this when Professor Shusterman introduced these topics, introducing Socrates in page 23-24, very well-known philosopher concerned with how to live a good life. This quest of wisdom recognizes the need for some knowledge through a self-examination. So probably from Socrates we start to think about wisdom and self-knowledge together, and then in the next page, the aim of self-knowledge is not true for truth's sake, but rather a ameliorative care of the self, epistemia ietu, and as an eventual consequence, the betterment on the society in which the self is situated. So we have here another important element. So the betterment of society, not just of the self. So this one is another topic that I try to relate it to Émile Cioran. Just now, very brief introduce about who was Cioran. Romanian by birth, German by education, French by adoption. According to Alain de Botton, Cioran is very much worthy of inclusion of the line of the greatest French and European moral philosopher and writers of maxims stretching back to Montaigne. Is the reason why I put in red Montaigne, Chamfort, Pascal, and Rochefoucauld. What they have in common of these four? Basically, they choose to write not using treatises, but confessions, maxims, aphorisms. Caustic Brereton described Turan as the 20th century Nietzsche, only darker and with better sense of humor. And well, there is here a note, just because when I talk about the German by education, because in 1933, before Turan going to live in France and to stay in France for the rest of his life, received a scholarship to University of Berlin, and then he studied Kant and Spengler and Fichte and other philosopher as Nietzsche, for example. So when we talk about Turan, basically we need to talk about two different Turans. The Romanian Turan can be described as a desperate and passionate lyricist, and this period is between 1944, 1937, very short period, because in this period he publishes this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books. So then he left Romania and went to Paris, went to France, and then we have the other Turan, the French Turan, the caustic, ironic, and disenchanted second-hand thinker. He defined himself second-hand thinker, or better, in an aphorism in German, Privatdenker. So in France, Turan published more than 30 books. The first one, Précis de Décomposition, A Short History of Decay. Now we start and the connection with Professor book. So is the art of writing essential to Turan arts of living? Let's try to understand what is art of living for Turan, for example. Art of writing and art of writing as well. Art of writing as a therapy and cure. This is what Turan thinks about art of writing. Writing is first and foremost an irreplaceable disposition, a physiological impulse. The justification of the practice of writing arises from a desire to break free from obsessions, from the perturbations that life and thought produce, or as we'll admit, Turan admit, to avoid a crisis. So this is the reason why for Turan, a book is something dangerous. And now we have two quotes, two passages of Turan. I will quote this, the first one. There is an even greater benefit of which the writer has a monopoly, that of getting rid of the dangers. Without the skill of writing pages, I wonder what would have become of me. To write is to get rid of one's remorse and grudges, to throw up secrets. The writer is a madman who uses the fiction of words to cure himself. I'm sorry that the lines are not completely like in my computer, so it is the words to cure himself. So this is the first one, and the other one, a book must stimulate pleasure, even provoke it. A book must be a danger. So, what do Wordsworth, Montaigne, Kierkegaard, and Turan have in common, starting from this point? The power contrary to the practice of writing for Turan, as we saw, is called therapeutic and gives the possibility to anyone to expose his worries, to expel all the malaise of the soul, to remove it as far as possible. So here, in my opinion, there is a possible contact or connection with the book of Professor Shusterman, when Professor Shusterman, in page 47, writes, as with Wordsworth and Montaigne, the core of Kierkegaard's writerly quest was the philosophical lies of self-knowledge and meliorative self-care that could also somehow enlighten others. So maybe there is a theme or topic of this discussion for next discussion. So, but now we have some problems. From there are some problems, some troubles. So literature as a form of survival. So this is my other question here. Can we consider literature as a form of just as a form of writing or a form of survival? And survival can be a synonymous of living, surviving as living, or there are a slight difference. So let's see what happened with Turan. Using a caustic, blunt, and deeply emotional style, Turan doesn't write to disseminate his ideas and opinions to an audience. This wasn't his first purpose. Choran writings have the mark of vertigo and lucidity. They are not written for pedagogical purposes, but to dispel his known suffering. This is the reason why he started to write. Resulting from a constant insomnia, he really suffered of this disease, that drives him to the brink of suicide. And thanks to that, thanks to a lot of writing, he desists from killing himself. Is just Choran explanation. Choran explained that in many books. So another possible problem when we talk about literature and philosophy and art of writing, art of living, is, of course, she was an essayist, a compulsive writer of aphorisms. Mostly all his book, all his bibliography is a collection of aphorisms. Mournful, misanthropic, and corrosive thinker. This is another topic. He argued that philosophy could not be expressed in treatises, but only in fragments. So this is another question for Professor Shusterman, if he's agree or not. In the form of an explosion, it's not just maybe a question about his agree. What Professor Shusterman think about this provocation of Choran? So, why the choice of writing aphorisms? Speaking about his decision, Choran said in Itineraries of a Hummingbird, is not a very short passage, and I would try to just focus on the red lines, but all the passage is important, in my opinion. I only write this kind of stuff because explaining bores me terribly. That's why I say I've written aphorisms. It's that I've sunk in fatigue, my bother. And so the aphorism is scorned by serious people. And when Choran talks about serious people, he's talking about professors, professors of philosophy, academic philosophers. And these serious people think, oh, look what this fellow said 10 pages back. Now he's saying the contrary. He's not serious. So I can put two aphorisms that are contradictory right next to each other. Aphorisms are also momentary truth. They are not decrees. So this is an explanation why he's using aphorism as style. But why the contradictions? There is another explanation, very interesting, in my opinion, by Kostika Bradatan again. Choran often contradicts himself, but that's the least of his worries. With him, self-contradiction is not even a weakness, but the sign of a mind. Is the sign a mind is alive. So another question for Professor Shusterman. So now I have just probably 4 minutes. I will try to be very quick. So another key point, key topic, self-knowledge, insomnia and self-analysis. An analysis of himself by insomnia in order to look into his own abysses and thereby into those of mankind itself. This is Choran. Again, Choran said that to us in many aphorism. I picked this one. If I only could, like any eremit, abandon the extreme exercise in which one reaches the intimacy of oneself. It is the dialogue of the ego with the self. In this case, the dialogue of the I of the self, or the ego, the passage from one to other that counts, and which only counts when it endlessly renewed. In such a way, I'm not only absorbing the other, an essential version. Self-improvement. And now I choose an analysis by João Maurício Barreiro Brás, a very important Portuguese scholar of Choran. When we talk about self-improvement in Choran, we have to talk about disenchantment. And about disenchantment, Barreiro Brás wrote, disenchantment is the balance of the transcendence of salvation or the immanence of wisdom, accepting his defeats and clinging to his illness. So here we have a very clear connection, interaction between wisdom and disenchantment. I have to go further. So he wants to erase from his memory the name of things, to look at them without perceiving and to listen to them without hearing, to turn his senses and desires into only slaves, to forget happiness and unhappiness. This very close position, for example, another important author like Grand Pessoa. But then the last key topic, wisdom. I'm just finishing, Bartholomew. So, wisdom of Silenus, very well known wisdom, as it's an anti-natalist philosophy via Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Choran learned this wisdom. And, you know, this is a quote from, a very famous quote from the Birth of Tragedy, the history, very old legend about the encounter between King Midas and the wise Silenus, companion of Dionysus. So it is the word, very famous word, said by Silenus. The very best thing for you is totally unreachable. To not to have been born, not to exist, not being nothing. And so Choran wrote this book, not in English, of course, in French first. This is a translation. The Trouble with Being Born is not just about the quotes of Nietzsche, but is about the problem of the trouble with being born. So how Choran, and I'm just in the end, how Choran tried to exorcise the absurd and the trouble to be born through or by the irony, because irony is capable of understanding the absurdity of life, and irony really saved Choran's and his readers from pessimism and nihilism. And more than this, could appear paradoxical, but can give a new rational meaning from which to start to live again without delusions. And now we have an example of irony just for you. I will read just the first one. What do you do from morning to night? I enjoy myself. In the other one, we have another position, and there is a Buddhism, another important influence for Choran. And now just the last point, a philosophy scholar against academic and systematic philosophy. He rejected intentionally system rules and academic formalisms. And here we have another aphorism of Choran, the last one. The professorship is the philosopher's tomb, the death of all living. Quote, the professorship is the spirit of grief. And just the last one, and then we have just a page of some quotes. So what wants Choran? He does not to claim to explain and demonstrate, but only to show what life is by talking about 4 major topics: himself as a man and second-hand thinker, learning to think against our doubts and certainties, the failure that marks every life and gives it meaning, the power of suffering. And here, just for you, I choose this 4 or 5 aphorisms. I will read and then it's the end. I'm nothing more than a Privatdenker, a private thinker. I try to talk about what I've lived, about my personal experience, and so I gave up making it work. Chaos is for you, Bartholomew, is rejecting all you have learned. Chaos is being yourself. Without failure, no spiritual achievement. Suffering, the only way to get to the feeling of existence. To suffer is to produce knowledge. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll get to it, even though it looks like I'm the dictator with time, so I better be good. Okay. Thank you so much, Antonio. And the title of my little fragment is called "Who's There? To Whom Am I Speaking? Inventing the Self and Conversing with the Dead." And it was kind of a response, a digressory response to your chapter expressing the ineffable. I I guess there's 5 little nuggets in that very rich and dense chapter. It's the 3rd chapter of the book by Professor Shusterman. And as I explain in the actual title, if you think of who's there, that's the first 2 words of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, who's there. And the second sentence is even more revealing. Nay, it's a negative, nay, stand and unfold yourself. So a fantastic way to open a play, given when we think through, the idea of selfhood, the art of writing and death and all these things. So, and the second quote is, "To whom am I speaking?" is originally from Herder, but which Kierkegaard loved to quote. And I'll give you the full quote in a second. And you find it in his journals, you find it in works of love, you find it in a reference to it in Fear and Trembling. There's also there, so it's around, and also in Sickness Unto Death, of course. So there's very key moments in the text where that quote will turn up. And you found it through the Magus of the North, or the Magus of the North, Haman. And so inventing the self is kind of connects a little bit to who's there, and conversing with the dead is connected to whom am I speaking. The 5 little points where I think, first of all, it's Professor Shusterman says when he goes through 4 thinkers, of course, Bataille, Blanchot, T.S. Eliot, and Russell. And he says regarding Blanchot, he said, "Our theorists like Maurice Blanchot right to argue paradoxically that only through the words of literature can we experience this non-discursive primary reality." It's quite a great sentence there. So for the word paradoxically and non-discursive primary reality. And I kind of say yes and no. Yes, but also I think a kind of philosophy can do that as well. And that's where I was hoping to talk about Joyce and Pessoa, but actually I'm just going to focus on Kierkegaard. But Kierkegaard is a great example of doing a new kind of philosophy, and because he's neither in the literature frame or neither in the philosophy frame. When I went to study in Denmark, and I would go to the philosophy department. No, he's a theologian. Go to theology. No, he's a philosopher. You go to philosophy. No, he's a poet. No, you go to poet. No, he's too involved in literary theology schemes, and you're lost. And Kierkegaard would have been delighted, So keeping that, the dissolving boundaries. The second thing I would like to kind of respond to indirectly, is that Professor Shusterman says, actually in his other book, Pragmatic Aesthetics, it's a wonderful book that actually had the 20-year reunion, 20 years, 30 years, another book, and he writes in the book, "Far older and grander than the recent interest in sports aesthetics, there looms an illustrious tradition of exploring aesthetics as a key to ethics and the art of living." So I kind of take that again as a starting point, thinking of Kierkegaard, the religious writer, who I would argue is writing some of the most aesthetic philosophy at the same time. Fear and Trembling, is considered one of the great religious texts, but actually it's utterly aesthetic at the same time. The way it's framed, the kind of the style that's given into that text, 100-page text, and that it's in different frameworks. Even the way of telling the story of Abraham, he tells it 4 times through different points of view, and then goes into the idea of tuning in. Stemning is the word in Danish, which is, of course, you can see where Heidegger got inspired by Stimmung, which is a beautiful word in German, but literally I really think that he inspired by Fear and Trembling, because a chapter title in Fear and Trembling is Stemning, which is a tuning in or a mood, or a fine Sau, it's tuning a guitar. You say this in German, das stimmt, that's right, it sounds right. The soundings, so Kierkegaard, speaking of sound and the Soma aesthetics, people forget that, and that's the problem. And sometimes Kierkegaard is read by the wrong people, that literally you can feel the Soma aesthetics that is happening through Kierkegaard on one level, kind of the one last great Christian thinker, but actually there's no accident that he's also the great existential thinker of reality, or this primal reality. The third point then is quoting Blanchot from The Space of Literature. You talk about, "When I speak, death speaks in me," quoting Blanchot, and you quote that in your chapter on page 70. And also, "He lives by dying in it." And that's kind of an enigmatic element, and we don't have time really to go into that, but I just wanted to throw it out there in the idea of conversing with the dead, writing as a form of almost conversing with the dead or becoming dead through writing. And of course, there's no accident that when we go back and we use this, the poster for this event is Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing and of death. You know, he's very much connected with both death and writing. So this idea of death and life, and it's nice using Kierkegaard again as a good example, because Kierkegaard means cemetery in Danish, you know, Kierkegaard, the philosopher who really, probably of the modern, so profoundly, we're looking at Choran, I heard many echoes of Kierkegaard there, the philosopher who really goes into thinking about death. But actually also at the same time, paradoxically, is probably, I would say, one of the funniest philosophers of modernity at the same time. Okay, there's nothing funnier than death. You know, he would, some other comedian, I think, once said this. So that's another element, that the third element. And the fourth is the idea of reality. Reality. When you talk about Blanchot again, you say language is what founds human reality and the universe. So this almost the logos, the classic, you know, conflict between the logos and myth is this kind of reality is in between, you know, and I'll quote someone even more radical. I remember I wrote something that Vladimir Lenin, of all people, wrote. He said, one must try to be as radical as reality itself. You know, this is a Bolshevik saying that one must try to be as radical as reality itself. But of course, what is reality? It's something, this kind of revealing this totality and non-totality of things. Imagination can be extreme reality and practical existence, and having a family and then dying and, you know, not thinking creatively, perhaps. That's a very strong absolute reality as well. So this is something that Kierkegaard was very struggling with as well. And then the fifth and last is the idea of revealing and concealing. That you talk, and there's a sentence you say, the play of concealment and awareness shapes literature's indirect mode of edification. So literature becoming a form of edification. And again, Kierkegaard is a good example because he's both writing scholarship and edification. I don't know if you're familiar, but in the Sickness unto Death, one of his later works, which is written by Anticlimacus, speaking of indirect communication, of course, he wrote under pseudonyms, many of his major works, where the opening lines talk about being, it's not scholarly enough to be considered for, you know, academic philosophy, but it's not edifying enough to be considered for you know, spiritual writing. So it's in between. Okay, so you have again Kierkegaard always enjoying himself in the boundaries of the two. Okay, so this idea of concealing, revealing, always happening. Now, I had a PowerPoint, but I have no time, and I have to stick to being the dictator on myself, you know, talking about self-therapy and aesthetics. Okay, so, but I've already pointed that out with Shakespeare, who's there. So literally, who's there? Nay, I forgot, answer me, stand and unfold yourself. So that could be the kind of standing point. Unfold yourself, of course, is again, this unleashing of oneself. And who's he speaking to? A ghost, the dead. You know, it's the opening sentence with it's the two guards. Bernardo, the guard, says, who's there? And the other guard says, nay, answer me, stand and unfold yourself. But just thinking of that as a way in to going into Kierkegaard, I'm thinking it kind of indirectly through Richard's book, Philosophy and the Art of Writing. Because for Kierkegaard as well, Shakespeare is number one, even though he never read English, he quotes him in German all the time. And I'll show a little moments of this all the way through Kierkegaard's books. You'll see him referring to Shakespeare, and especially in Fear and Trembling, there's a very a moment where you realize how dear Shakespeare is to Kierkegaard, and it kind of applies to your thought that Kierkegaard will say. I might as well say it now. Well, there's a moment in the book, in the third part of the book, a very short book, Fear and Trembling, third part of the book, and he suddenly stops and says, all the systems of morality can never capture what. I'll actually just show it you now. It's right here. Let's see, make it easier. Do I have to share this again? Just don't want to waste time. Is that available?
No, you need to do the share screen.
No, good.
Share. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Okay, just very quickly. Am I back?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
full screen if you can.
Okay, so his monologue in the first act of Richard III has more value than all the systems of morality, which have no intimation of the nightmares of existence or of their explanation. And then he goes on to quote the opening lines of Richard III, one of the most diabolical characters in Shakespearean plays. Natures such as Gloucester's cannot be saved by mediating them into an idea of society. Ethics actually only make sport of them. So there you go. That's just a little key into that there for that. Okay, so Well, Kierkegaard, the quote I'm thinking of as well is this one here, okay? Right for whom? Right for the dead, for those in the past whom you love. Will they read me? Yes, for they come back as posterity. How much time have I got left?
5 minutes.
Okay, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there you have, right for whom? Right for the dead, right for those whom you love. Will they read me? Yes, for they come back as posterity. And he finds that via Haman, actually. And Kierkegaard likes to go back to Haman quite a bit. And he uses Haman's, one of Haman's lines for the epigraph for the motto for Fear and Trembling. And again, he goes back to it again. He was almost going to use another epigraph for Fear and Trembling from Haman, but he decided not to. And he inserted it into another book called Repetition, which was published, I think it's the same day as Fear and Trembling. So he published 2 books in the same day, of course, with his name nowhere to be seen. So I'll only have 5 minutes. So just to show you again, elements here, again, where you see it turning up, who am I speaking? This is in Stages in Life's Way, another text later on. Again, Kierkegaard is nowhere to be seen. There's at least 5 authors in this text. And Frater Taciturnus, the silent brother, or Quidam, which is a whatness, says, the scene is among the graves at dawn. Simon Leprosus is sitting on a stone, has dozed off, wakes up and shouts, Simon, yes, Simon. Yes, who is calling? Where are you, Simon? Here. With whom are you speaking? With myself. Is it with yourself? How lonesome you are with your leprous skin, a plague upon all the living. Does not the artist hide in order to be a secret wisdom to how his work of art is admired? Okay, again, the mask of the artist bringing forth this terrible leprous figure. Okay, Stages of Life's Way is probably the most opaque text of it. And at the very end of the book, the very long book, he says, my dear reader, but to whom am I speaking? Perhaps no one at all is left. And what happens after he says that? He spends the next 3 pages celebrating the Danish language in probably the most beautiful Danish prose I've ever come across, which he knows nobody will understand this language. It's such a kind of primitive little language that nobody understands, but I'm going to enjoy myself now. And that's Kierkegaard again, the other side of Kierkegaard, relishing an aesthetic of language, but actually going into a world of maybe some aesthetics. Literally, he's playing, he's breaking up the language. And we didn't have time to talk about someone like James Joyce. James Joyce does that in literature all the time as he goes further. But Kierkegaard is already doing that as well. And people forget that in the Danish language, he's probably the finest prose writer of the Danish language. And the last one, to whom am I speaking? Who cares about these high-powered psychological investigations to the nth degree? The Nuremberg pictures that the pastor paints are better understood. They deceivingly resemble one and all what most people are, and spiritually understood nothing. The Nuremberg pictures, of course, was kind of pre-cinema. It was when 19th century you had these kind of magic lanterns showing pictures, and it's Anticlimacus kind of making a joke out of that. At the same time, before that, he's talking about what is a religious poet? What should I be? How can I write? Who am I writing to? This is a constant challenge for Kierkegaard. And just, I know I've no time left, unfortunately, but even this is an example, the front page of Fear and Trembling. Let's look at this, because you see, for me, this is a great example of, I think, combining the new kind of philosopher who's extremely aesthetic, but also, of course, it's extremely spiritual, upbuilding at the same time, and it's also doing serious philosophy, attacking the Hegelian contemporaries. Kierkegaard was utterly indebted to Hegel. His problem was the Hegelians. As he said when he read Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer said, I have windbags to deal with all the time in Germany. And Kierkegaard said, you have windbags, I have wind suckers. They're sucking in the wind of the back, the people that are sucking, blowing out the wind. It was wonderful. Kierkegaard actually discovered Schopenhauer at the end of his life and said, I disagree with everything he says, but I love him. He kind of found out, this is great. He's like the inverse of me. He's Arthur Schopenhauer, I'm S.A. Søren Albie. So it was interesting. He really loved his honesty and his kind of bullish humor. And so here you have Fear and Trembling, which is a quote from the Bible, Philippians, when he says, when St. Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So you have the religious element there, the dialectical lyric, the paradox here. Dialectic is the philosophy, lyric is the poetry by Johannes de Silentio. Here you have the theater, the masked one, the indirect communication. Remember, Kierkegaard also, it's his 2 greatest figures are Socrates and Christ, and they are brought together for 3 reasons, really. Well, they're both martyrs. They died for the truth in different ways. 2, they speak indirectly in parables. Socrates using the meiotic method and Christ using the parables. And they are work incognito. The wisest man in Athens is looking like a beggar, smelly and dirty. And you have Jesus Christ, of course, is the Son of God and the Messiah, and hangs out with prostitutes and fishermen. So these are, and they're also very much practical people who don't write. And yet the paradox of Kierkegaard, of course, and Kierkegaard loves paradox, he still is dedicated to writing all the time. Paradox is everything to him, as he would say. The thinker without paradox is like the lover without passion, a mediocre fellow. So, and so you have of the fourth of the element there, you have Johannes the Silentio, of course, John the Silent, speaking the silence. So it's going through that kind of some aesthetics, speaking somehow. We still have to speak the silence, and I think it does it a lot better than Wittgenstein does, even though Wittgenstein also was a great reader and saw Kierkegaard as a saint. And the last then, of course, is the quote from Hamann: "What Tarquinius Suburbus said in the garden by means of the poppies, the son understood, but the messenger did not." So very indirect communication. Making communication, you have to kill these people. Here are the poppies, the flowers are cut off. The son understood very quickly. Okay, boom. And so this is the message. And there's another element of this book. It's a journey with Abraham, turning Abraham into some kind of hero, but is also the father of faith, and also a madman and a murderer. And it's something communicating the impossible. But at the same time, it's a personal. You can look at this as a very autobiographical book, where it's Kierkegaard's own kind of indirect communication with his dead father and his dead relationship. And then, of course, as I said from the beginning of the book, it's this little quick talk. It's very much aesthetic. So to answer your kind of throwing down the gauntlet, I see this text, Fear and Trembling, as extremely aesthetic. It's a work of art, but it can also be viewed as a great way of trying to get inside the unspeakable of faith. And he says somewhere else, faith is the inner certainty that anticipates infinity. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barry. We have around 15 minutes now for discussion, because it might be more than that, but we aren't sure, because the room is only booked until 6 o'clock. So we might be kicked out at that time. But until then, we have 15 minutes.
Okay, so yeah, I think 15 minutes is enough. Thank you very much, both of you. I don't know Choran's work very much, but what I can say is the idea of being very comfortable with contradictions. It's something that Emerson always insisted upon, and our world is full of contradictions. So in some way, to go back to the theme of wisdom, part of wisdom, at least as I understand it, is to recognize that there are contradictions in the world, and it's kind of impossible to have a kind of streamlined, organized theory of everything that is coherent, because they're all different languages. Translation is sometimes impossible, and so I'm a believer in contradictions and in trying to live with them. So that brings me to Barry's or Bartholomew. I mean, I like the name Bartholomew. It has a nice ring to it, a kind of rhythm, and I don't like the American way of Robert becomes Bob, Raymond becomes Ray. They don't ask you if it's okay. They just decide. It's one of the things of efficiency, which is sometimes the destroyer of beauty. And actually, that's why one of the reasons for some aesthetics is because to solve the design problem. I didn't want to talk about body aesthetics, because then it's top models and bodybuilders and all the wrong kinds of things that I didn't want to talk about. And also, I was educated in philosophy in Jerusalem and Oxford, where you write aesthetics with the diphthong, AE. But when I came to work in America and became a pragmatist, it's much more efficient and ecologically better to drop the A, because the A has no function. You don't pronounce it, and it doesn't change the meaning. And so in the European languages, probably Portuguese as well as Italian and French, it's just an E. But I found the AE much more attractive. And so some aesthetics allowed me to keep the A in aesthetics without having a bad conscience. So yeah, it solved a really problem because I'm an appreciator of beauty, and I'm glad you understood the Kierkegaard chapter, in a very, very deep way. And this blurring of the boundaries and confounding of the artificial boundaries is something that is part of my work in general. I mean, I believe in the need to make distinctions for a particular context, but I don't like when the distinctions become these categories that prevent the kind of productive mixing. And so part of the Man in Gold, that project, is to play with all these boundaries by kind of showing how arbitrary they are. And so, for example, where do you put The Adventures of the Man in Gold book? The bookstores in Paris, unfortunately, they still exist. They still have some bookstores in Paris besides the FNAC. It's not all been overrun by Amazon and other internet functions. So where did you put that book? In the art section, because there are 48 color illustrations and the book has thick pages like an art catalog? Or do you put it in the literature because it's a philosophical tale, although it's illustrated like a graphic novel? Or do you put it in the philosophy section? So it was a problem for the booksellers to actually decide where to put the book. And I'm a big admirer of Kierkegaard for playing with those boundaries and just realizing that writing is a continuity, and how you divide it, sometimes it's very easy, but sometimes when it comes from an inspirational spark, that takes you in a way where you don't. Let me start again. Usually when you write a book, you have an audience in mind, especially if you're an academic writer. You're writing for a particular genre of philosophy or about a particular author, and you're writing either in a new critical mode, historicist mode, a deconstructive mode, a post-colonial mode. You have this kind of framework. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you get possessed by something. And this goes back to Antonio's point about being possessed. And so the Man in Gold book was a product of being possessed. And so when you have that kind of experience, an idea, a possession, then it kind of breaks through those sort of things, and you have to get it out, and it's like a torment, and you need to get it out. And then when you get it out, you don't know exactly where to do it. And sometimes what goes back to the theme of philosophy as a way of life, and maybe back to the Foucauldian direction, is that with all the talk about self-knowledge and self-cultivation, I go back to you. To whom are you talking? Who's there, right? Because part of the work, my work in philosophy as a way of life, is kind of losing a hold on a clear idea of who I am and becoming something different. So part of the self-knowledge and self-cultivation can also be a challenging of the self who you are, and the kind of uncertainty of becoming something different, and also getting away from yourself. So one of the ways of understanding the man in gold is a liberation of the philosophical writerly self and becoming another person who doesn't write, who doesn't talk, who doesn't behave like the well-mannered philosopher, and who is free of that. But, and I think one of the things that one can take from Kierkegaard is this recognition of the multiplicity that can exist in a single person, and the recognition that behind that multiplicity, there might not be one stable, permanent kind of thing. And maybe that multiplicity is good for projecting different messages at different times. And also, again, I don't know how true it is for Kierkegaard, but it's also, but at least it's true for me, is that, and here maybe I'm different from Chiran, is that there's pleasure in play. There's pleasure in the aesthetic. And I feel that with Kierkegaard, he took pleasure in having all these masks because it allowed him to be something that he couldn't fully be, in the sense of his commitment to being like a hyper-Christian in a world where Christianity was dead, but Christendom dominated the whole world. And, you know, I can't pretend to penetrate to the core of Kierkegaard, if there is such a thing, but I think he had a lot of fun with all these aliases because it enabled him to take pleasure in his writing ability, which was astounding, and he was an appreciator of writing. And I think the interesting thing is, you know, Jesus was his only teacher, right? Socrates couldn't be a teacher because he was a pagan, but he admired these people who really weren't writers, yet his essence, as he defined it, was being a writer. So, you know, that's another kind of paradox where sometimes the cultivation of the self is a transcendence of the self to the other. And I think there's a positive way of understanding it, but what I found in Bataille and Blanchot, and that's the connection with the dead that you bring out so well, there is another way of connecting with the other, and that's connecting with life beneath the level of the individual. You know, that Nietzsche talked about the Ur-Eine, you know, the Dionysian flux where all us individual people were just like bubbles that will burst, and the real flow is life, and death and sexual contact, when you lose your sense of individuality, is another way of realizing the real that can be frightening, but you know, it's reality before language, because language individuates objects and predicates, but for Blanchot, Bataille, Nietzsche, and probably Chiran as a secondary Privatdenker, beneath that level of rationality, there's this kind of flux of chaos and continuity. And, you know, we recognize and then forget. So yeah, so there are a lot of overlapping themes in the book, and the man in gold is an example of another personality and of doing philosophy through a different personality, because the man in gold gave the vision of the book, and I was just an implement.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for
One or two comments, or until it kicks in?
Yeah, so there's a question online, I noticed.
One or two.
That's right. You please,
Just say
please, Barry.
So again,
That's right.
I think it's just, it's important when you, I totally agree with you when you talked about the idea of distinctions, you know, and yeah, it's important to make clear, Kierkegaard was very, you know, rigid in making distinctions. It wasn't that he was just saying, let's just have everything flow in all kinds of directions. He was very rigorous thinker. But that's the play in Kierkegaard, but he had the talent to also make it seem like everything was completely ramshackle or all over the place, or there was, so he was dissolving these boundaries, but at the same time, always very clear to show there are distinctions. And I think the second thing to follow up, it's very interesting that when we had more time, but that's what, when he says, to whom am I speaking again? He says this at the end of Works of Love, which is written under his own name this time. So this large work, just before Sickness of the Death. The last chapter is called The Work of Love and Praising Love. And it's actually Attack of the Poets this time. So he doesn't let anyone go off the hook. He says, the work of love and praising love. And then he'll say, well, the poets, they knew how to praise love, but did they really love? You know, so he talks about what is love and the action of love. And then you have some aesthetics coming on. And then halfway through, he says, but to whom am I speaking? And then he literally quotes verbatim the passage from Herder again. So that's always the way with Kierkegaard. So not only the philosopher, but he's also very much keeping the poets on their toes. And I'll say again that so this element here is the spiritual. He's the poet against the aesthete against the poets. He's the religious thinker against Christianity. Contra, but somehow this joy going through it the whole time. And also, it's interesting, I think it's important to make a last point, is that when you say, yeah, of course, he only looked to Christ because he wasn't the pagan. At the same time, there's another element to Kierkegaard, the fairy tale, which is very body-orientated. That's almost overlooked with Kierkegaard as well, because you'll see that it's in the fairy tale where we have first access to our bodies and also spiritual edification, you know, as children, because you learn imagination, you learn how to indirect communication, you learn how to start thinking pre-Christian. So he never lets go of the fairy tale, even though he's always attacking the pagans. But the pagans to him a lot of the time are modern day Christians, of course, you know. So there's this element there all the time. And then the last thing, when you mentioned secondhand thinker, it's great because in Fear and Trembling, I don't know, Choran was obviously read Kierkegaard at that time, but because Johannes Lentio calls himself the extra scriber, which literally means extra writer. He says this all the time. I'm just a private thinker. He says this many times under different synonyms. He says this when he's Johannes Clementus, I'm just a private thinker. And in Johannes and in Fear and Trembling, I'm just an extra writer. Of course, he's being very ironic as well at the whole time, but he's keeping the philosophers. He's attacking the philosophers. When the philosophers get ahead of themselves, he writes something about Hegel. He says, if Hegel had just written at the end of The Science of Logic, this was an experiment, he would have been the greatest thinker of all. As he didn't, he's utterly comic. So this is so there you go. Just a comment. I don't know if you want to say something. I know we can talk about it later.
I think it's Professor Shusterman showed the important connection and I just wanted really to understand how much Professor could be agree with Choran and where, and the topic of contradictions is very important to me as well, as something really
I will learn as a philosophical instrument or path for wisdom, for knowledge, studying from Pessoa. Fernando Pessoa love contradictions, and what you said about the multiplicity and what we can find behind the multiplicity, just one thing but not stable, is exactly what Fernando Pessoa is. And in some way, Turan wasn't so multiple like Kierkegaard and Pessoa, but he tried to be nothing in many ways. He really was obsessed by the nothingness, but in a mystical way. So this is I think that's a way to create multiplicity and to create something unstable behind multiplicity is something that Pessoa has to run really try to achieve, but in a very peculiar and a very I can say mystical, but in not a classic term. So it's just in a special path they try to do, just to understand how the nothingness can really be considered the only path philosophers and poets had and they have still to embrace the everything. So it's like in the Buddhism, you know, you have to make the nothing inside you just to embrace all the world, you know. So nothing is not a negative action, but it's positive, because only if you are empty, you are ready to be full. Yes, yes. But it's a process, you know. We know that for Buddhism, it's not just theory, but it's practical as well. So we have to create our emptiness inside us, or chaos is another way, for example. So this is another question, that's the last one. How emptiness and chaos can be considered, if we can consider, of course, I'm trying to provoke, it's a provocation. It's possible to consider talking about these terms, chaos and emptiness, as synonyms.
There's one other question in here as well, yeah.
I know, yeah. Professor, think we can really achieve this conclusion, or just, you know, we are just, you know, speculating, or we are using these words in a radical way, because sometimes I think that emptiness and chaos that starting from the well, it's clear that they are opposite in the common sense, but I believe that emptiness and chaos can really talk and can really be very close to each other.
Perhaps you could group the two questions together.
There's a question from someone here as well, again from CLS, the mysterious CLS. Did you have any extreme of emotions when being the man in gold?
And there's a second question?
That's it. That
was the second one.
And then is there a connection between emptiness and chaos?
So I can put them together. I mean, in some way, the phenomenon of the man in gold is a kind of emptiness. It's an emptying of my ordinary self that allows the possession of the man in gold to take hold of you. So in other words, and so of course there's a ritual dimension of it, which is putting on the suit. And the idea here, and there's a philosophical idea behind it, is the lack of autonomy and independence, that all individuals depend on someone else. And so the man in gold can only exist when I'm together with Jan and we're both in the mood. And then this is another kind of an experience of the unmaking of the self that enlarges, that creates a different self, a wiser self. And this is the experience that some women used to have, maybe some of them still do, of not being able to fully dress themselves because Jan has to zip me up at the back. I cannot do it myself. More importantly, he also has to unzip me. Otherwise, I can't get out of this. And so the idea is that ritual zipping up becomes a kind of emptying of a different identity and the taking on of another one. And what does the man in gold do? It depends on where he is, because it's like channeling the energy of the particular space. And so again, the actions aren't predetermined by a script. They depend on what's there. And that is also, it has a philosophical message. I mean, this all happened by accident. The whole story happened by accident. And there's a religious context. I say this for Bartholomew, is that the man in gold was born and baptized in the Abbaye de Royaumont, which was the Cistercian abbey where King Louis, Saint Louis, used to go to celebrate the Mass in secret, because he knew that if people knew that he was witnessing the Mass, it would be done in a different way. So the idea is like, again, the behavior of the individual always depends on the context. And so the soma in somasthetics is mind, body, environment, because we transact with the environment. We take in the air, we expel the air, we take in the food, we expel the waste. So the individual is always in this kind of contextual nature. And so the philosophy as a way of life also depends on the context in which you live. So the question is, do I feel an emotional high?
Do you have any extremes of emotions?
Yeah, well, you know what? The man in gold does. You know, I wouldn't, his behavior is different from mine. I would not walk into a restaurant in that costume. But that's also like part of that project. You know, the French have this word, maybe it's something similar in Portuguese, partager, partager, partage. Partager means to share, but it also means to divide, because when you share, you divide. And so the question is, there's a continuum of art and life. The man in gold is somewhere in between, just like Kierkegaard is in between theology, philosophy, literature, and just religious devotion. And so that doesn't mean those distinctions are unreal, but it just means that they're contextual. And one of the values of, I don't know about chaos, but I think confusion is something that's disturbing. Yeah. But disturbing is also creative and productive. And so I think artists and philosophers, in the best sense, are people who enjoy and look for the disturbing and the confusing, because that's where creative developments come from.
And maybe the philosopher and the poet are messengers. You know, think of Hermes.
That's
so
right.
You can be very rigorous and have distinction, but you can also, there's ultimately a figure like Kierkegaard or with some things are doing with the man in gold or some aesthetic, it's being some kind of messenger. Even in either his first work, which is 800 pages, halfway through, they'll say, the judge says, if you understand what I'm getting at, throw away this book and start living. So there's different ways of entering different texts, because Kierkegaard makes an art out of doing that. So you can be an extremely zealous, Lutheran pastor and read Fear and Trembling, or you can be an extremely aesthetic person in the kind of Flanerian way and read it, or you could be a philosopher like Heidegger and read it as a very serious erudite text of philosophy. so that it has that openness. And so the Hermes element is there, the hermeneutics of it.
I think it even fits with, I mean, going back to our ancient literature, as Julius Demansky pointed out, there's a reason we keep getting this atopos language about the philosopher. He's written several essays on why the personality of the philosopher is without place, and it is this kind of frustrating transitional space. And I was even thinking back to our true discussion of, like, I think part of the interest in the true and ancient philosophy is this interest of what the transitional space gives us of a bigger perspective. That's kind of breaking away from the normal something else, the bigger whole, the bigger something else.
And it should remain frustrating.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm still reading Kierkegaard. It annoys me so much, but he caused me to question. I keep going back. That I think a philosopher should be somehow cause some kind of frustration.
Well, look at
that
the
space of being useless, of that space of being, what's the point? That's where the starting point is then, you know, in a way.
What is the seventh letter but that frustrating dialectics with the occasional moment where something breaks and you get a little bit of the
Who
whole.
says that?
It's in this Plato seventh letter. You know, we talk about dialectics, we go over dialectics again and again, and sometimes you get into the flame of inspiration hits you, and you get this kind of complete aspect. And I was even thinking back to your Hamlet reference, and I had never thought about the other famous quote in that play in relationship to philosophy as a way of life. One of Seneca's descriptions of philosophy as a way of life is, of course, care of the self and knowledge of heaven and earth, which are very classical in antiquity. But of course, what's the line to Horatio? There's more things, dear Horatio, there's more things in heaven or dear Horatio than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
Yeah.
But like, I think the kind of interesting philosophical reply, and even Neoplatonism has, is, well, there is a whole, there is a true, but it's not the kind of true you can get with by sitting still. It's the one we have to keep working for, right? It's the one that you keep practicing to get at. This is why Hegel, to give that kind of weird third to Kierkegaard here, says the true is in the whole, but it's just the whole that we never quite frustratingly get at.
And Hamlet also says at one point, by indirections find directions out. Kierkegaard, by indirections find directions out. But again, not losing the sight of getting too cloudy. It's just we are always confronted with barriers, but then you have to find another way.
Sorry, you want to just say anything to close up?
Pardon?
Close out
Well, I made sure everyone could hear. Actually, it was I asked personally, said everyone was fine. So hello everybody again, whoever's left, and we'll just say thank you very much, especially of course to Professor Richard Shusterman. This workshop has been dedicated to, and try to find his book if you can, Philosophy and the Art of Writing. And I hope it was a nice introduction into some of the themes and topics that he navigates, and also the man in gold. This seems to be, philosophers are doing more things like this as well. And of course, to all the contributors for taking the time to respond and read. And I think for many of us, it was the first time encountering your work as well. So, and especially thanks to Ellie as well for also kind of contacting Marta about doing this. So keep in touch with both Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, the project that Marta is leading. Many of us in this room are a team. We'll be doing various things over the next.
We're presenting next.
Okay, I think next month, is it May?
In May 10th.
10th of May. Keep in touch. There's an independent website on Mapping Philosophy as a Way of Life, and also you can find it on ifilnova as well, also through that way in the Culture Lab. So thanks very much, especially to Richard Shusterman. Until the next time. Okay.